What happens when the most important seconds of history belong to someone else? Not the people who lived through it, not the families who carry the weight afterward, not the public that tries to remember together. Someone else, an editor, an agency, a committee, a locked room with a sign on the door that reads, "Authorized personnel only." Imagine a man standing on a small, concrete pedestal in bright Texas light. He isn't famous. He doesn't work for a network. He's not thinking in headlines or ratings. He's thinking about a weekend story he can show friends later, the kind of home movie that lives in a drawer until grandchildren find it. His hands steady a camera as a motorcade glides into view. The scene looks ordinary at first. People smiling, the soft choreography of public life. Then the world breaks in a way that doesn't feel real until you see it frame by frame. A camera can do that. It can turn disbelief into evidence. It can take what the mind tries to protect itself from and make it permanent. In a few seconds, it captures something so heavy that everyone who touches it afterward becomes part of its gravity. Witness, messenger, gatekeeper. In the days and years that follow, that short reel becomes the most analyzed piece of film in modern history. It is studied like scripture and treated like contraband. Still, images leak out like glimpses through a half-open door. The full motion, the full truth of movement stays in the dark. Some say it's decency, some say it's prudence, some say it's fear. But the result is the same. The public's memory is not allowed to be whole. And once you start noticing this pattern, you see it everywhere. There are other films taken that day, from other angles, by other ordinary people. They, too, are collected. Copies are returned like consolation prizes, worse quality, more distance from the original. Families ask, decade after decade, for the first-generation evidence back. Sometimes they're told it's misplaced. Sometimes they're told it never existed. Sometimes they're told it's not theirs anymore, even though it began in their hands. This isn't only about crime scenes or political tragedy. It shows up at the edge of deserts, where the fences are far from the buildings and the air itself seems to vibrate with secrecy. It appears into the aftermath of disasters that unfold in public and yet remain partly private, where there are more cameras than anyone can count, and still there are angles the world is not meant to see. It lives in archives labeled with dates long past, where footage from decades ago remains sealed as if time itself cannot cool it down. Sometimes the reason is clear. A nuclear test is not just a historical event. It is a blueprint, a lesson in physics written in light. A spaceflight disaster is not just a tragedy, it is a family's grief, and the line between investigation and intrusion is not easy to draw. Some images are withheld because we do not know how to look at them without turning them into spectacle. But other times the explanation feels thinner than the silence. Why would the cleanest record of a moment be erased, reused, misplaced, especially when the moment is one of humanity's milestones? Why would the best evidence of what happened be degraded in the copy, missing in the original, scattered across agencies and vaults like a story broken into pieces? When we talk about history, we often imagine something solid: dates, documents, monuments. But history is also a sequence of images we inherit. It is the footage we replay until it becomes our shared understanding. When that footage is incomplete, our understanding becomes incomplete too. We argue over shadows. We fill gaps with assumptions. We fight over interpretations not only because we disagree, but because we are missing the same missing things. This is a story about those missing things, not as proof of any single theory, not as a hunt for villains, but as a human question that keeps returning. Who owns the record of reality? When a camera captures a moment that changes everything, does that moment belong to the person who pressed record, to the institutions that arrived afterward, or to the public that must live with the consequences? We will move through 14 chapters, like rooms in a long archive. In each, we will begin with an image, a pedestal in a plaza, a desert ridge at dusk, a bright plume rising into a silent sky, a shuttle's arc turning to fire, and follow what happens after the shutter closes. We will listen to the reasons, weigh the ethics, and sit with the unease that lingers when a memory is kept behind glass. Because the most haunting secrets are not always about what happened. Sometimes they're about what we were allowed to see. What if the clearest witness to a national tragedy wasn't a person at all, but a strip of film? On a mild November day in 1963, a man climbed onto a small concrete pedestal in Dallas. He wasn't there as a journalist. He was a clothing manufacturer, a neighbor with a weekend plan, carrying a home movie camera that felt almost out of place among flags and smiling faces. He nearly left the camera at home. Someone encouraged him to go back for it, the way we nudge each other towards small choices that later feel immense. He returned, found his spot near the curve of the street, and waited for the motorcade like anyone might wait for a parade. The first frames looked like ordinary America. Sunlight on metal, the soft glide of official cars, the crowd's easy anticipation. And then, without warning, the scene changes. The camera keeps rolling as sound fractures the moment. A head turns. A hand rises. A body collapses into a posture that will haunt a century. A wife's instinct becomes motion, climbing, reaching, trying to undo what cannot be undone. The man filming could not help. He could only record. That is both the power and the cruelty of a camera. It makes you a witness without giving you the ability to intervene. When the film was developed, the images were so stark that even the person who shot them struggled to watch. There are stories of him sitting with the reel afterward, stunned and shaken, as if he had accidentally opened a door that should never have existed. And then the next chapter began, one that had nothing to do with bullets and everything to do with custody. By the following morning, a major magazine negotiated to purchase the rights. The price was astonishing for home footage, as if money could match the weight of what the camera had captured. The transaction was legal. It was business. But beneath the paperwork lay a deeper question. Can a private company own a public memory? The magazine published a few still frames, images frozen into silence. But the moving picture, the sequence of time itself, was kept away. The reel went into a vault. For years, most Americans did not see the motion of that day. They heard descriptions. They saw selected photographs. They carried second-hand impressions, not the full unfolding of seconds. There were reasons offered, and some were humane. The footage was graphic. The family deserved dignity. A nation's grief didn't need to become a looped spectacle. Those arguments weren't trivial. They still aren't. Anyone who has ever stumbled across a violent video online knows the difference between knowing something happened and watching it happen. But withholding also has a cost. When a society cannot see what it is grieving, it fills the blank space with imagination. A still image invites interpretation. A moving image invites argument. People debated what the film might imply, about angles, timing, human reaction. Investigators, journalists, and citizens wanted access, not because they craved horror, but because they sensed that truth can become fragile when filtered through selection. Eventually, the film surfaced in more public settings, first as evidence, later on television. When the moving images finally reached millions of living rooms, the reaction wasn't just shock at the violence, it was shock at the gap. A whole generation realized it had been living with an edited memory. Some viewers felt relief, as if seeing the truth, even painful truth, closed a long open wound. Others felt newly unsettled, as if the film raised questions that the still frames had kept asleep. And many felt something quieter, a recognition that history doesn't only happen. History is managed. The camera on that pedestal did not create mystery. It recorded a moment. The mystery grew afterward, in the decisions about who would hold the reel, who would decide what could be seen, and when the public was allowed to look directly at the seconds that changed everything. If an image can be locked away, what else can be delayed? And when we finally receive the record, years later, do we inherit truth, or do we inherit the shape of someone else's choices about truth? It started with a simple knock, polite, official, and impossible to ignore. A man answers his door and finds strangers with badges, the kind that turn a living room into an interview room without asking permission. They speak softly, with the practiced calm of people who already know what they want. They are not there to admire his camera. They are there for what it saw. In the hours after the gunfire in Dallas, people who had filmed the motorcade discovered something unsettling. The story didn't end when they lowered their cameras. For some, the second act began immediately. An approach in a hallway, a request that sounded like a command, a receipt that felt like a leash. Another witness stood, closer to the curb, holding a camera that cost more than a month's rent. His angle was different. His footage might have caught details the famous pedestal film missed: shadows, motion, the sharp geometry of where a sound came from. He developed the film. He showed it to authorities. And then, almost as quickly as it entered their hands, it seemed to vanish into the machinery of official custody. Years later, he would say he tried to retrieve the original. He would say he was given something back: copies, fragments, versions that felt like someone had pressed a thumb against the lens. The first generation, the cleanest record, was gone. This is where the story turns from tragedy into something more ambiguous, a question about ownership. In ordinary life, a photograph belongs to the person who takes it. A home video belongs to the family who recorded it. But in extraordinary moments, moments that become national trauma, private property begins to blur into public interest. Authorities argue that evidence must be preserved. Investigators say they need originals to study. Lawyers speak of chain of custody, authenticity, and courtroom rules that don't care about personal sentiment. All of that can be true. And still, there is something uneasy in the exchange. The way a citizen's record becomes state material, the way an artifact of grief becomes an object that can be sealed, reclassified, filed away. The tension is not always sinister. Sometimes it is simply bureaucratic. A reel is labeled incorrectly. A clerk moves it to a different shelf. A storage box is sent to the wrong facility. Years pass. Administrations change. People retire, die, forget. Time itself becomes a kind of confiscation. But other times, it feels more intentional. Not because someone is hiding a grand secret, but because institutions have a reflex: control the narrative, manage the image, reduce uncertainty. In the months after Dallas, the nation needed coherence. Leaders needed calm. Agencies needed to show competence. And the rawness of moving footage, its capacity to inflame, to confuse, to invite endless interpretation, was a problem to be solved. So the public learned history in still frames, in official reports, in the careful language of commissions. It learned to treat a tragedy like a document rather than a living sequence of moments. Yet people kept searching for the missing angles, not because they wanted chaos, but because a single viewpoint can become a cage. We know this in our private lives. A family argument retold by one sibling sounds different than when the other sibling speaks. Memory is not only fragile, it is plural. A complete understanding often requires more than one pair of eyes. Footage is supposed to help with that. Film doesn't choose sides. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't forget. It simply shows. But film can be interrupted. It can be taken. It can be locked away until the world changes enough that the release no longer threatens the present. And this is the quiet heartbreak of the confiscated reel. It is not just evidence lost. It is trust eroded. Each missing original invites suspicion in the space where transparency should have been. Each degraded copy creates a shadow where clarity could have lived. In a way, confiscated footage is a lesson about how modern societies grieve. We don't just mourn what happened, we mourn what we cannot fully know. So here's the question that hangs at the end of this room in the archive. When institutions take custody of our most important images, are they protecting us from harm or protecting themselves from the consequences of uncertainty? The desert has a way of making human secrets feel small. In the early hours before dawn, the sky over an empty stretch of sand looks like it has never been touched by history. No streetlights, no billboards, just a thin horizon, and a silence so complete it feels like a sound of its own. People who worked out here learned to read that silence the way sailors read weather, because sometimes, without warning, the silence would be replaced by a light brighter than the sun. A visitor might think the danger ended when the blast faded, when the mushroom cloud drifted and thinned into a pale bruise against the blue. But for those who carried cameras, the danger often began afterward. During the decades of nuclear testing, footage was power. Not metaphorically, literally. A moving record could reveal yields, shockwave behavior, the shape of a fireball, the speed of a plume. It could expose how close observers stood, what instruments recorded, what structures survived. And in the wrong hands, it could become instruction. So the cameras in the desert lived under rules. Some belonged to the government, mounted on steel frames, locked to tripods, aimed with intention. Others were personal, newsreels, documentary crews, hobbyists who believed they were witnessing the frontier of science. A few were taken by workers who wanted to show their families the strange reality of their jobs. This is what I saw today, as if the day were ordinary. But the boundary between official and personal was never stable. In the world of tests, everything touched by the light could become classified. There are stories of people filming from a ridgeline miles away, catching a distant flash and the delayed roll of thunder like a storm arriving out of order. Stories of a camera seized, not because it revealed a secret weapon, but because it proved the camera had been there at all. Sometimes the confiscation wasn't about what the footage showed. It was about what it implied: access, proximity, vulnerability. And sometimes it was about exposure, in another sense, the human cost. Decades later, veterans and nearby communities would speak about illnesses, about dust, about the slow arithmetic of radiation that doesn't announce itself in the moment. Footage that captured people standing in the open, watching the sky erupt, could become a kind of accusation, not against a villain, but against an era's confidence. It could turn pride into discomfort. It could reframe progress as something that came with a bill no one wanted to pay. If you wanted to understand why footage disappeared, you had to understand what images can do to a story. Governments don't only classify information, they classify emotion. They decide which images the public should carry in its mind, because images shape what a society demands. A few seconds of film can change what people tolerate, what they forgive, what they question. So the desert became an archive with locked doors. Some recordings were stored, catalogued, and eventually released after years of declassification. Others remained out of reach, not because they contained a single explosive truth, but because they were too complete, too clear, too hard to explain without changing the meaning of the entire enterprise. And this is where ethical complexity enters, quietly but firmly. There are real reasons to restrict certain footage. Knowledge can be dangerous. A blueprint is not a neutral object. The history of the 20th century is proof that what begins as curiosity can become catastrophe. But there is another truth, equally real. Secrecy can be a habit that outlasts necessity, a reflex, a default posture. Once the doors are closed, it becomes easier to keep them closed than to decide, case by case, what the public deserves to know. The desert doesn't argue, it simply waits. And somewhere in that waiting, a human question remains. If a camera records the moment a civilization learns to split the atom's heart, who should decide how that moment is remembered? The scientists who built it? The officials who feared it? The citizens who live in the world it created? Or does the desert, in its indifferent silence, remind us that some truths are too large to be owned at all? It began as a smudge on the edge of the frame, an accident of distance and heat shimmer. A cameraman lay prone on a rocky rise, the kind of posture you take when you want the earth to steady your hands. Far below, the desert looked empty, but he knew what was hidden there. The scaffolds, the instruments, the towers, the careful geometry of an experiment too powerful to improvise. He checked his focus again and again, not because he doubted his skill, but because he doubted the day. The world was about to do something it had never done before, and he wanted proof that it had happened. When the countdown ended, the camera captured an instant that still feels unreal in hindsight, a rising light that erased the horizon, a bloom so white it turned the film into a wound. The sound came later, arriving like the voice of a giant. Dust leapt. Shadows moved in the wrong direction. The camera kept rolling because that was its only job, to persist. Later, in a dark room or a makeshift lab, he watched the footage again. That's when he noticed the smudge, not a flaw in the lens, not a speck of dust. Something moving in the far background, a shape that didn't belong to smoke or cloud or debris. He rewound. He watched again. He told himself it was nothing. And then the footage was gone. Not destroyed in flames, not lost in a flood, just removed. A request, a signature, a transfer to proper storage. The kind of phrase that sounds responsible until you realize it is also final. The reel left his hands and entered a system where the doors closed behind it. It would be easy to turn this into a story about a hidden object, a secret silhouette, a mystery in the sky. But the deeper mystery is simpler and more human. Why did a smudge matter enough to trigger removal? Sometimes the answer has nothing to do with aliens or fantasies and everything to do with data. Nuclear tests were filmed with obsessive thoroughness because film was measurement. The shape of the blast, the speed of expansion, the behavior of shock waves against structures. These were not merely dramatic visuals. They were information. A moving artifact in the background might not be a spacecraft. It might be an aircraft that shouldn't have been there, revealing a surveillance program or a security lapse. It might be a ground vehicle placed in an unauthorized location. It might be a worker caught in the open, evidence of risk that the official narrative wanted to keep tidy. It might be nothing, an illusion of distance, and still be treated like something, because in high-stakes environments, the safest assumption is always caution. And caution has a price. The cameraman, like many who recorded consequential moments, found himself erased from his own record. He could describe what he saw, but description is not the same as proof. He could remember the real, but memory can be questioned. He could insist it existed, but insistence is often interpreted as obsession. This is how a person becomes lonely inside a story, not because they are lying, but because they are missing the one thing that would make others believe them. Years later, a few clips emerged through official channels, clean, curated, accompanied by calm narration. The public saw the light and the cloud, the grandeur of technological power. What it did not see was the unpolished margin, the accidental corners of the frame where the real world tends to leak in. This is one of the quiet lessons of confiscated footage. The center of the image is rarely the only truth. Sometimes the most important details are the ones the camera operator didn't even know he was capturing. In our personal lives too, the margins matter. The background of a childhood photo, the furniture, the posture, the expression no one posed for, often tells you more than the smile in the middle. History works the same way. A nation remembers what it chooses to center, and it forgets what it treats as peripheral. But the peripheral is where doubt lives, and doubt is not a threat by itself. Doubt is a form of humility, a recognition that our understanding is partial and our access incomplete. The danger is not doubt. The danger is what fills the void when doubt is starved of evidence. So the smudge on the frame becomes a symbol, not of an alien visitor, not of a grand conspiracy, but of the fragile contract between those who witness and those who manage witnesses. If a single unexplained movement at the edge of a film can cause the film to disappear, what does that say about our relationship with uncertainty? And when institutions decide that certain ambiguities are too risky for the public to see, are they protecting truth or protecting a version of truth that feels easier to live with? The ocean keeps secrets differently than the desert. Where the desert hides with distance and fences, the sea hides by swallowing. A thing can vanish beneath the surface and become instantly a story without an ending. No footprints, no debris field you can walk through with your own eyes. Just coordinates on a map and a widening silence. On the night the ship went down, the sky was a low ceiling of cloud. The water was black glass, broken by scattered lights and the restless chop of cold wind. Cameras were there. Of course they were. In the modern world, cameras arrive the way ambulances do. They appear on decks, in helicopters, on the shoulders of reporters who know that a tragedy at sea becomes a tragedy on land only when it is seen. A passenger had been filming earlier, laughing at something small. An offhand joke, a drink lifted in a toast. A crew member recorded a training drill, the kind of footage meant for internal review. A nearby vessel caught the ship's silhouette on its horizon, a dark mass against darker water. In the chaos, people reached for their phones the way they reach for prayers, trying to make sense of the moment by capturing it. And then, afterward, the requests began. Some came with empathy, officials asking families not to share graphic images, investigators urging restraint so rumors wouldn't spread. Some came with authority, claims that certain videos might be evidence and therefore needed to be secured. Some came with persuasion, promises that the footage would be returned after analysis, that it was only temporary, that cooperation would help everyone understand what happened. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent. At sea, disasters generate a strange dual obligation: to honor the dead and to learn from the event so it never happens again. Those aims can align, and they can also collide. A video that shows a structural failure could help prevent future loss. That same video might also expose negligence, fuel lawsuits, or amplify blame before facts are established. In that tension, institutions often choose control, not necessarily out of malice, but out of instinct. And families are left in the cross-current. A woman watches a shaky clip that may contain the last moments of someone she loved. Her hands tremble, not from fear of the image, but from the weight of what it represents. She wants to share it because it proves something, because it might force accountability, because it might stop the world from moving on too quickly. She also fears sharing it because she knows how the internet can devour pain and call it content. When authorities take the footage, they take more than evidence. They take the family's agency over its own grief. There is a quiet cruelty in that, even when the motives are sincere, because grief is already a loss of control. To lose control over the record of grief feels like losing the person twice. Some footage reappears later in official briefings, short excerpts, blurred faces, timestamps carefully positioned. The public sees enough to understand the scale, but not enough to feel the full texture of the moment. The messy, human reality is trimmed into something more manageable, like a storm, rendered as an icon on a weather map. And maybe that is done to protect us. But protection can also become erasure. The most painful images are often the ones that carry the most truth, not just technical truth, but emotional truth. A calm voice in a briefing can describe panic, but it cannot replicate the tremor of a hand holding a phone. A report can list failures, but it cannot capture the sound of a corridor filling with water, the small, ordinary curses people mutter when they realize the ordinary world is gone. When those recordings disappear into custody, we lose a kind of honesty that cannot be recreated later. Yet there is an ethical knot here that can't be cut with outrage. Some images should not be broadcast. Some moments deserve privacy. A society that turns every last breath into spectacle becomes something colder, something less human. The question isn't whether restraint is necessary. The question is who gets to decide what restraint looks like, and whether the decision can be trusted. Because trust is the true currency of catastrophe. If you believe the footage is being held to protect dignity and ensure accuracy, you can accept the silence, at least for a while. If you suspect the footage is being held to manage liability, reputation, or public outrage, the silence becomes its own kind of injury. And in that injury, another pattern emerges. The more the record is controlled, the more people begin to imagine what they were not allowed to see. The ocean, indifferent, keeps swallowing. But on land, we keep asking the same question in new forms. When a tragedy leaves behind images that could clarify, comfort, or convict, what matters more? The public's right to witness or the private right to grieve without becoming part of someone else's narrative? It was supposed to be a clean arc. White flame, blue sky, a line drawn upward with confidence. On the morning of the launch, people gathered the way they gather for miracles. School children watched on televisions wheeled into classrooms. Engineers watched from consoles with coffee cups sweating in their hands. Families watched from bleachers and sandy berms, squinting into the sun as the rocket rose like a cathedral moving. For the first minute, everything looked like it always looked. Steady ascent, controlled thunder, the familiar promise that this time would be routine. And then routine broke. A bloom of light, a sudden branching, an instant of confusion where the mind tries to label what it's seeing as harmless, stage separation, a trick of wind, a glitch in the broadcast. Then the pieces begin to fall, and the brain can no longer hide behind optimism. In the hours that followed, cameras became both comfort and threat. There was official footage, of course, high-speed film meant for engineering analysis, tracking cameras on towers, radar, and telemetry streams. But there were also personal recordings. A father with a camcorder capturing what he thought would be his child's lifelong inspiration. A tourist filming from a hotel balcony. A technician recording behind-the-scenes moments, never imagining they would become a last record. Those personal recordings held something official footage often misses: the human sound of the moment, the intake of breath, the shouted questions, the small, stunned silence after the sky changed shape. They carried the immediate emotional truth that reports would later translate into sterile language. And because they carried that, they were often collected. Some people were asked politely to hand over their tapes for analysis. Others were told it would help investigators reconstruct the event. A few later remembered the feeling of being guided, firmly, respectfully, into a process that didn't feel like a request at all. The tapes went into evidence rooms, into labs, into archives. Many were never returned. In one sense, the logic is obvious. Catastrophic failure in aerospace is never just a tragedy. It is a technical puzzle with life or death stakes for the future. Every angle helps. Every frame can reveal a flame pattern, a structural breakup, a timing difference of fractions of a second. Personal recordings might catch something official cameras missed: a puff of smoke, a strange asymmetry, a moment that confirms or challenges an assumption. But that is only one layer of why the footage disappears. The other layer is the way images can threaten the stories institutions tell about themselves. Space agencies trade in awe and trust. They ask a public to believe that risk is measured, that loss is mourned, that progress is worth the cost. They are right to ask for that belief. Yet when a disaster happens, raw footage can produce an emotional verdict before any technical conclusion arrives. It can make the public feel viscerally that something went wrong in a way that words cannot soften. It can turn a complex failure into a single, unforgettable picture. Sometimes, withholding is meant to protect dignity. Sometimes, it is meant to protect the public from turning grief into entertainment. Those motives can be sincere, even noble, and still, secrecy creates a shadow. Because the people who lost loved ones are not only grieving, many of them are also searching. They want the truth not as a headline, but as a form of respect, an acknowledgement that their loss has meaning beyond sorrow. When images are locked away, families can feel as if they are being asked to accept conclusions without seeing the ground beneath them. The public, too, begins to split into two kinds of watchers: those who trust official summaries and those who suspect that the missing footage holds something crucial. Not necessarily scandal, not necessarily sabotage, often simply clarity. The tragedy becomes not only what happened in the sky, but what happens afterward on Earth, how information is filtered, how memory is curated, how a shared event becomes a managed artifact. And time complicates everything. Years later, fragments resurface. A brief clip in a documentary, a still frame in an anniversary piece, a slowed-down segment used to illustrate a point. The footage arrives like a message from the past, with pieces missing, and the gaps invite interpretation all over again. People debate what they see, not because they love controversy, but because the record feels incomplete. This is the paradox of modern witnessing. Cameras are everywhere, yet the most important moments can still become inaccessible. So we return to the question that keeps echoing through these rooms of the archive. If the goal is to learn, to honor, to prevent future loss, doesn't a society need the courage to look carefully, ethically, fully at what it has lived through? Or are there some images we lock away not because they are too secret, but because they are too honest? It started with a radio call that sounded almost casual. A pilot, high above the ocean, described a light on the horizon. Not a ship, not a city, something moving in a way that didn't fit the familiar catalogue of the sky. The voice on the recording, steady, trained, carried a subtle shift that people who work in high-risk jobs recognize immediately. The moment when routine gives way to attention. Somebody, somewhere, was rolling a camera. In the age of radar and satellites, it's easy to assume that the sky is fully watched. But much of what we call watching is data without texture, blips, vectors, numbers that describe motion without showing shape. When a video appears, grainy, distant, inconclusive, it changes the conversation. Not because it settles anything, but because it invites the eye, and the eye invites the human need to make meaning. That need is powerful enough to scare institutions. Aboard ships and aircraft, in control towers and command centers, cameras have long served practical purposes, documenting tests, training, unusual encounters, technical anomalies. Sometimes those recordings are mundane. Sometimes they capture something rare, an object that accelerates oddly, a heat signature that doesn't match known aircraft, a moment of confusion between what instruments report and what people think they're seeing. When such footage escapes into the public, it does what data alone cannot. It becomes a story. And stories have consequences: political, cultural, emotional. They can reframe budgets, provoke questions, create waves of belief and skepticism that spill far beyond the original event. Even when the footage is ambiguous, its very existence can feel destabilizing, like a crack in a wall that was supposed to look seamless. So in many cases, the first response is containment. Not necessarily the theatrical kind, the cinematic scene of agents grabbing a tape hoard and disappearing into the night, but a quieter version. The file marked restricted, the disk labeled property of, the memory card collected for review. The witness is thanked, reassured, told that the material will be handled properly. In the moment, the witness often believes it. They want to cooperate. They want clarity too. Then weeks pass, months, years. What returns, if anything, may be incomplete, lower resolution, cropped. A copy that feels like it has been handled too many times. The witness begins to doubt their own memory of what the original looked like. This is another quiet cruelty of controlled images. They can erode the witness from the inside. Of course, there are legitimate reasons to restrict recordings from military systems. Some footage reveals sensor capabilities, camera mounts, aircraft performance, even the rhythms of patrol patterns. To release it casually could compromise operations or reveal vulnerabilities. The line between transparency and risk is not imaginary, but there's a second line that is harder to name: the line between caution and discomfort. Ambiguous footage is uncomfortable because it refuses to give a clean answer. It doesn't resolve into a headline like Solved. It forces an institution to admit uncertainty, and uncertainty is often treated like weakness. In public life, confidence is currency. A blurred object on a screen can threaten that currency not by proving something extraordinary, but by reminding everyone that the world is larger than our categories. That reminder can be handled with humility or with control. When control wins, the public receives a simplified narrative, an explanation offered quickly, a label applied with authority. Balloon, drone, optical illusion. Sometimes those explanations are correct. Sometimes they are incomplete. The problem is not that explanations exist. The problem is when explanations arrive with less evidence than the questions deserve. Because a healthy society can tolerate uncertainty. It can say, "We don't know yet, and we will keep looking." What it struggles to tolerate is the sense that the looking is happening somewhere else, behind doors that don't open. That sense creates two kinds of people, those who accept official certainty and those who feel pushed into suspicion simply because they're not allowed to see the full record. The tragedy is that both groups are responding to the same human need, stability, and the same human fear, that reality is being narrated without them. In the end, the confiscated clip becomes less important than what it symbolizes. It symbolizes a modern paradox. We live in an era of constant recording, and yet the most consequential recordings can still vanish into procedure. The camera makes a promise. This happened, and we can prove it. The vault breaks that promise, not always, but often enough to leave a bruise on trust. So the question we carry forward is not, what was the object? The deeper question is, when uncertainty appears on the horizon, do we meet it with openness and shared inquiry? Or do we meet it with a file cabinet and the hope that time will do the forgetting for us? It began with a photograph that wasn't supposed to exist. A young researcher sat in a fluorescent-lit room, scrolling through an archive that felt more like a warehouse of forgotten time than a library. The images were labeled in tidy rows, dates, locations, project codes. Most were routine, equipment, landscapes, men in hard hats smiling beside machines. Then the researcher found it, a frame from decades earlier, a blurred, angled shot taken in motion. In the corner, half hidden by glare, was something that didn't fit the caption, a structure that looked unfinished, or too advanced, or simply unfamiliar. The kind of detail you might overlook if you weren't looking for it, until you were. He enlarged it. He adjusted contrast. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of perspective. Then the file disappeared. Not from the internet. This wasn't that kind of disappearance. It vanished from the internal system with the quiet efficiency of a record being reclassified or moved. A link that had worked an hour ago returned an error. A folder that had been there in the morning was suddenly empty when he asked a colleague. The colleague frowned and said gently, "You probably didn't see what you think you saw." There is a special loneliness to being told your eyes are unreliable, especially when your work depends on precision. In archives that belong to large institutions, government agencies, corporations, universities with defense contracts, there is always a second architecture behind the visible one. Two doors, where you thought there was one. Two versions of history, the one the public can browse, and the one that lives deeper in the building, under stricter rules. People who manage archives often speak about sensitivity. That word can mean many things. It can mean national security. It can mean personal privacy. It can mean ongoing legal disputes. It can mean that a file contains something that embarrasses an institution, undermines a narrative, or contradicts a tidy timeline. Sometimes sensitivity is justified. Sometimes it is a blanket thrown over a mess that no one wants to untangle. And the mess, more often than not, is human. A photograph might show a worker in the wrong place at the wrong time, violating safety protocols. It might reveal that an experiment failed more dramatically than reported. It might show an early prototype of technology whose development was politically complicated. It might expose the ordinary truth that progress is not a straight line. It is a trail of mistakes, detours, and half-truths told in the name of morale. When such images surface, they threaten not the science itself, but the story we tell about science. We like our breakthroughs clean. We like our institutions competent. We like to believe that someone is in control. Archives, however, are where control meets reality. A single photograph can become a thorn because it refuses to stay in its intended box. It invites questions. What was happening here? Who approved it? Why wasn't this included in the official record? It opens a door to complexity, and complexity demands time, humility, and sometimes accountability. Those are expensive, so the photograph is moved, or hidden, or relabeled, or lost. To the archivist, this may feel like stewardship, protecting people from misunderstanding, protecting systems from misuse. To the researcher, it feels like something else, a reminder that knowledge is not only discovered, it is also permitted. The internet age makes this tension sharper. We have grown used to searchable truth. We assume that if something existed, it can be found. But that assumption is a luxury, and it can be revoked. A server can be reorganized. A database can be gated. A file can be flagged. And unlike a missing object in a physical room, a missing digital record leaves no dust trail, no empty space on a shelf. It leaves only absence, clean and absolute. In the days after the photograph vanished, the researcher did what many people do when they sense something slipping away. He asked others if they had seen it. A few had, most hadn't. Some were interested, some were nervous, some warned him kindly to let it go. That kindness is another kind of control. It doesn't feel like intimidation. It feels like protection. Don't ruin your career. Don't create trouble. This isn't worth it. But what if it is worth it? Not because the photograph proves a hidden world, but because it reveals a hidden habit. The habit of smoothing the edges of reality until history becomes easier to digest. So we arrive at an uncomfortable question, one that isn't about any single image. If archives can be edited after the fact, if memory can be rearranged with a few keystrokes, how do we keep our shared understanding honest? And how many truths have we missed, not because they were impossible to know, but because they were quietly removed from the shelf before we learned how to ask? What if? The most consequential evidence was never meant to be cinematic, only clinical. A hospital hallway at 2:17 a.m. is a place outside ordinary time. The lights are dimmed to a patient shade of yellow. Shoes squeak softly on waxed floors. Somewhere, a machine breathes for someone who can't. In one room, a doctor leans close to a monitor, watching numbers pulse like a second heartbeat. Down the corridor, a small camera is recording. In many emergency departments, cameras exist for safety, to deter violence, to document incidents, to protect staff and patients alike. In some cases, body cameras are worn by responders. In others, CCTV watches entrances and corridors like an indifferent eye. And sometimes, when a case becomes unusual, when something goes wrong, when the timeline matters, when allegations are made, those recordings become the most important witness in the building. Yet those recordings are often the first thing to disappear from the public story. A family may be told that their loved one received appropriate care, that all protocols were followed. The words are carefully chosen, as if precision could replace visibility. The family asks for footage. They are told it's restricted. They are told it's protected health information. They are told it belongs to the hospital. They are told it is under review. They are told many true things. Privacy laws are real. Dignity is real. No one wants the worst day of their life circulating online, reduced to a clip that strangers argue about. But there is another truth that sits beside the ethical one. Footage can also be liability. It can show hesitation, confusion, miscommunication. It can show the human limits of a system that is always one staff shortage away from collapse. And because it can show that, it becomes sensitive. Sometimes the footage is preserved, but only for internal review. A committee watches it behind closed doors. A report is produced in calm language, translating messy seconds into tidy conclusions. The family may receive a summary. They may never receive the images. What does that do to grief? It creates a grief with questions in it. A grief that cannot settle because the mind keeps returning to what it cannot see. People replay their last phone call, the last text, the last moment they were in the room. They build timelines out of memory, out of overheard remarks, out of the tone of a nurse's voice. They become investigators, not because they want to be adversarial, but because they need a story that makes sense. A camera could give them that story, but a camera can also complicate it, because footage is honest in a way that language isn't. It shows the delay between a call button and a response. It shows the number of times a staff member walked past a door. It shows whether a patient was left alone. It shows the difference between intention and outcome. And once that difference is visible, people ask a different kind of question. Not, what did you mean to do, but what did you actually do? Institutions often prefer the first question. The second question carries consequences. This is where the familiar pattern returns. Confiscation as a form of narrative management. Not always by force, sometimes by policy. Sometimes by the simple fact that access requires power. Legal power, financial power, time to fight a system designed to outlast individual endurance. Meanwhile, the recordings sit on servers with expiration schedules. Many systems overwrite footage after weeks or months, not as a conspiracy, but as an administrative routine. Yet routine can become a shield. If a family doesn't know to ask quickly, the record disappears on its own, and the absence looks like fate. In that absence, trust fractures quietly. People begin to wonder, if the footage would confirm what you're saying, why not show it? If it would clear someone's name, why keep it hidden? If it would reveal error, why should the family carry the burden of not knowing? But then another question rises, equally important. If the footage shows a person dying, do we have the right to look? The ethics here are not simple. Transparency can protect the vulnerable, but it can also expose them. Accountability can save lives, but it can also turn private suffering into a public trial. The balance is delicate, and a society that chooses either extreme, total secrecy or total exposure, loses something essential. So perhaps the real question is this: can we build a world where evidence can be reviewed honestly, shared responsibly, and held with care, so that truth is not locked away and dignity is not sacrificed? Or will the most human moments of our lives, our endings, our emergencies, our last chances, remain recorded, stored, and withheld, leaving families to mourn not only a person, but a story they will never fully know? What if humanity's most famous first step was never the clearest version of itself? Picture a room filled with monitors, each one a small universe of static and light. It's July 1969. The air conditioning hums. Engineers in white shirts lean forward with the intensity of people listening for a heartbeat. Across the world, living rooms glow with television snow, ghostly images that still manage to feel miraculous. A ladder, a boot, a shadow that looks like history learning to stand. Millions watch, but what they watch is not the best that exists. Somewhere in the chain between the moon and Earth, the signal is transformed. It travels as a fragile stream meant for specialists, then converted again and again, so that ordinary televisions can display it. Each conversion is a compromise. Each step trades clarity for compatibility. And in the end, the public receives a version of the moment that is watchable but not pristine. The pristine version, the original telemetry and video data, still exists, at least for a while. It is recorded on specialized tapes, stored in controlled facilities, labeled like treasures that don't yet know they are priceless. Then, in the years that follow, the tapes become something else. Inventory. Not sacred, not untouchable, not a cultural artifact, guarded as carefully as a national monument. Just reels on shelves in an era when data storage is expensive, space is limited, and yesterday's format becomes tomorrow's inconvenience. Someone needs tape for another purpose. Someone sees a shelf and thinks in terms of utility rather than legacy. Someone believes copies are good enough, and so the unthinkable happens in a way that looks almost ordinary on paper. The best record is misplaced, reused, or lost. The broadcast that the world remembers, the soft, blurry footage that feels like a dream, becomes the official face of the event. Not because it was the only record, but because it was the one that survived the machinery of time. This is not a story about villains in dark rooms. It's about how institutions behave under pressure and how the future is often damaged by the everyday habits of the present. The moon landing was a triumph of engineering. The loss of the highest quality tapes was a failure of imagination, an inability to foresee what people would need from the past. We assume that the most important moments are automatically protected by their importance. But importance is a feeling, and systems do not run on feelings. Systems run on procedures, budgets, priorities, and the quiet decisions of people who are tired at the end of a shift. In that quiet, history can be overwritten without malice, like chalk washed away by rain. Years later, archivists and engineers try to recover what's missing. They search warehouses, old databases, mislabeled boxes. They consult retired staff who squint into memory the way people squint at the horizon. They find fragments. They find alternate recordings. They find ways to improve the surviving broadcast feed. Better contrast, clearer motion, less noise. The restored footage is beautiful in a restrained way, like an old photograph, carefully cleaned. But restoration is not resurrection. Even when you enhance what remains, you cannot reclaim what was never preserved. The original's full detail, the exact texture of that first movement in lunar dust, belongs to a past that didn't know how to keep itself. And that loss matters beyond aesthetics. Because clarity is not only visual, clarity is cultural. The sharper the record, the harder it is for cynicism to take root. The clearer the evidence, the less room there is for people to claim that shared reality is negotiable. When the best footage is gone, the event becomes easier to doubt, not because doubt is warranted, but because human beings are vulnerable to uncertainty, and uncertainty is fertile ground. The moon landing still stands as an achievement beyond dispute, yet the missing tapes become a parable about modern memory. We can cross vast distances, but we can still misplace the proof of what we've done. So the question lingers like a small, persistent echo in the big quiet of space. If even our brightest moments can be partially lost to bureaucracy and reuse, what does that say about the way we treat the present, this fleeting, recording-filled present, as it becomes the past? And what other first steps are we living through right now, believing they will be remembered without realizing how easily they might be overwritten? The most unsettling thing about missing footage is how ordinary the mechanism can be. A label falls off a box, a storage room floods, a hard drive fails, a tape format becomes obsolete. Someone says, "We'll digitize it later," and later never arrives. In the story of human memory, catastrophe is not always fire and collapse. Sometimes it is a slow, administrative forgetting. In a quiet building far from any launch pad or battlefield, a technician sits in front of a machine that looks like a relic from another era. The machine reads old media, tapes, reels, discs, formats that once carried the weight of national projects. The technician's job is simple, in theory: transfer the data to something modern before it dies. But the technician is not working with a single tape. There are thousands. Some are clearly labeled, some are not. Some contain priceless history. Some contain static. Some contain sensitive material that requires special handling. Each tape is a little gamble of time and effort, and budgets rarely honor gambles. So choices are made. Not dramatic choices, practical ones. A supervisor prioritizes one archive over another. A project is delayed. A contract ends. A team is reassigned. A database of catalog entries is migrated poorly, and a set of records becomes orphaned, still physically present, but digitally invisible. This is how footage disappears without anyone deciding to hide it. Yet even in the realm of accident, disappearance has consequences, because we don't experience missing records as neutral. We experience them as gaps, and gaps demand meaning. When evidence is absent, the mind becomes an author. It writes theories, suspicions, and stories, not because it wants to deceive, but because it cannot tolerate emptiness. Uncertainty is a kind of pain, and the brain tries to soothe it. Institutions, too, cannot tolerate uncertainty. They soothe it differently. When a record is missing, an agency may issue a statement: "No such footage exists," or "We have no record of that," or "The material was destroyed in accordance with policy." These phrases can be truthful. They can also be incomplete. Sometimes no record means not in the accessible system. Sometimes destroyed means overwritten. Sometimes doesn't exist means exists somewhere we are not searching. The public hears the phrase and registers finality. The institution may mean something else entirely: limitation. This mismatch becomes fertile ground for mistrust. We have seen it with the moon landing tapes, with disaster footage, with recordings from conflicts and investigations. A missing reel becomes a symbol far larger than its physical size. It becomes a referendum on transparency. It becomes a test of whether the public believes the people in charge are honest, competent, and respectful of collective memory. And here the story becomes deeply human, because the people inside institutions are human too. They are not faceless machines. They are individuals navigating risk, pressure, and the fear of being blamed. When a record is lost, someone somewhere feels shame. Someone worries their career will end. Someone convinces themselves it isn't important, because admitting importance would mean admitting harm. The path of least pain is often denial. But denial does not erase consequences. It simply shifts them outward onto everyone else. In the absence of footage, families keep asking. Researchers keep digging. Journalists keep filing requests. Enthusiasts keep building amateur archives. Sometimes they find what was missing in private collections. A tape in a garage, a reel in a drawer, a copy made decades ago by someone who didn't know it would matter. These recoveries feel like miracles, not because they reveal hidden plots, but because they reveal how fragile memory is. A civilization can put a human on the moon and still lose the tape. What does that say about our current era? Where we produce more video in a day than earlier generations produced in years. We assume abundance equals security, but abundance can also mean neglect. When everything is recorded, the value of any single recording feels lower. In a flood of data, the temptation is to let the river carry things away. And yet, some recordings will matter more than we can imagine. A protest filmed from a window, a medical procedure recorded for training, a body camera clip, a climate measurement, a voice memo, a child's face. The ordinary becomes historic without warning. So the question becomes not only about confiscation, but about stewardship. In a world where the evidence of our lives is stored on fragile formats and managed by systems built for efficiency, how do we ensure that the future inherits something truthful? And if we fail, will the missing footage of our own time be seen as a conspiracy, or simply as the most predictable outcome of a species that never learned how to keep its memories safely? A small room, a folding chair, and a television that hums with static. An old man sits with the posture of someone who has been asked to remember too many times. His hands rest on his knees. The light from the screen paints his face in pale flickers, and for a moment, he looks like he belongs to the footage he's about to describe, half present, half archival. He is not a celebrity, not a politician, not a headline maker. He is simply someone who held a camera when history passed close enough to touch. He tells the story the way people tell stories that still hurt, with pauses, with careful words, with a kind of humility that comes from knowing memory can be attacked. He says there was a tape. He says officials took it. He says he was promised it would be returned. He says he received a copy that wasn't the same. He says the original, his original, was gone. If you listen closely, you hear two losses. The first is the obvious one, the loss of a record, a piece of film or tape that contained a specific sequence of seconds, a viewpoint that cannot be recreated. The second is quieter, the loss of authority over his own experience. Without the original, his witness becomes negotiable. People can nod politely and move on. They can say, "Are you sure?" They can blame age, stress, imagination. They can treat him like a rumor rather than a person. This is what confiscated footage does to those who made it. It turns them into storytellers in a world that only believes pictures. In earlier centuries, testimony was a primary tool of history. We relied on letters, diaries, oral accounts. We knew truth was filtered through human perception, and we learned to read between lines. But modern life has trained us differently. We trust what we can see, and we distrust what we cannot. The camera has become a kind of moral witness, and when it is taken away, the person holding it becomes unfairly suspect. Yet even as we depend on images, we also fear them. We fear what they can do to reputations, to institutions, to nations. We fear how easily a clip can be misunderstood. We fear how quickly outrage can spread. We fear the way a single frame can become an emblem that erases complexity. The fear is not irrational. It is the downside of visibility. So society lives in contradiction. We crave evidence, and we restrict it. We see this contradiction in every chapter of this journey. In Dallas, where a home movie became a national relic locked away. In deserts, where film was both measurement and risk. In disasters at sea and in the sky, where recordings became both grief and liability. In hospitals, where cameras meant for safety can become a battleground over truth and dignity. In archives, where the most important tapes can be lost, not to malice, but to negligence. Again and again, the same pattern. A moment is recorded, and then the record becomes contested territory. At the center of that territory is a fundamental struggle, the struggle between private experience and public meaning. A person records because they want to hold on to something. A family records because they want to remember. A citizen records because they want to bear witness. But when the subject becomes bigger than the person, when the footage touches national security, public trust, legal risk, or cultural identity, ownership shifts. The record becomes a lever, and those with institutional power reach for it. Sometimes they reach with good intentions. Sometimes they reach to protect. Sometimes they reach because the alternative is messy accountability. And always the people who pressed record are left holding an emptiness where their evidence used to be. What happens then? Some people go quiet. They decide the fight is not worth it. They protect themselves, their families, their sanity. Others become advocates, filing requests, writing letters, speaking at hearings, turning their private frustration into a public campaign. They are sometimes praised for persistence and sometimes mocked as obsessive. But what they share is the same hunger, the hunger to make reality verifiable. Because a life lived through uncertainty is a life lived with friction. This is not only about famous events, it is about the fabric of modern truth. Our era depends on recordings to settle disputes, to expose abuse, to defend the innocent, to correct false narratives. If those recordings can be taken, lost, degraded, or controlled, then truth becomes vulnerable, not to a single conspiracy, but to 1,000 small forces: bureaucracy, fear, convenience, and the human temptation to manage discomfort. The old man in the folding chair looks at the dark television after the clip ends. For a long moment, he doesn't speak. And then he says something that isn't an accusation, but a confession. I just wanted people to see what I saw. That desire is the heart of this entire story. Not sensationalism, not paranoia, just the human need to share reality. And the question it leaves us with, as we approach the final chapter, is painfully simple. If truth depends on what we can witness together, what happens to a society when its most important witnesses are asked to hand over their eyes? At the end of every archive is a locked door you never noticed at the beginning. We began with a home movie in sunlight, an ordinary citizen filming a public moment that turned into national trauma. We moved through deserts and oceans, through launch pads and hospital corridors, through the quiet bureaucracy of storage rooms and the invisible architecture of restricted files. We met not villains, but systems, systems that protect, systems that hide, systems that forget. And through it all, one question kept returning in different costumes. Who owns the record of reality? It's tempting to answer with a rule: the state in matters of security, the family in matters of grief, the public in matters of history. But real life does not arrange itself neatly into categories. It overlaps, it blurs, it asks us to live in tension. A nation needs safety, a community needs trust, a family needs dignity, an investigator needs evidence, a society needs shared memory. Sometimes these needs align, Sometimes they collide in ways that feel impossible to resolve without harming someone. So perhaps the more honest question is not who owns the record, but how we hold it. Because what we call footage is rarely just footage. It is a piece of time, a small container for something that otherwise would evaporate. It is a witness that does not forget. It is also a mirror that can force us to see what we would rather not see: our failures, our limits, our compromises, our capacity for harm. That is why images are powerful. And that is why images are feared. When footage is confiscated, it can be for reasons that deserve respect. Some recordings reveal dangerous capabilities. Some reveal private suffering that should not be consumed by strangers. Some could inflame a fragile moment, turning grief into a spectacle or uncertainty into panic. There is wisdom in restraint. There is humanity in guarding dignity. But when confiscation becomes habit, when security becomes a reflex, when review becomes a permanent limbo, when policy becomes a shield against accountability, the result is not protection. It is erosion. Erosion of trust. Erosion of shared reality. Erosion of the quiet civic bond that says, we may disagree, but we will start from the same evidence. Without that bond, a society becomes vulnerable to its own imagination. Not because people are foolish, but because people are human. When the record is incomplete, we fill the gaps. When we feel excluded from the truth, we search for it in shadows. When we are told to accept a conclusion without seeing the ground beneath it, we either surrender or resist, and both responses can fracture a community. This is why missing footage matters, even when it contains nothing extraordinary. The extraordinary thing is the absence itself. The absence teaches us something uncomfortable about modern life, that we can record everything and still lose what matters, that technology does not guarantee transparency, that memory is not a natural outcome of events, but a responsibility, that the truth is not only what happened, but what can be shown. In the best version of our future, we do not treat this as a battle between secrecy and exposure. We treat it as a craft of stewardship, clear rules about preservation, independent oversight, ethical release practices, and the recognition that evidence can be shared responsibly without becoming entertainment. A craft of humility, admitting uncertainty when it exists, resisting the urge to force every ambiguity into a tidy label. A craft of compassion, protecting the dignity of individuals while still honoring the public's need for honest accounting. Most of all, a craft of memory, because a civilization that cannot keep its records cannot keep its lessons. When you think about it, that's the deeper reason this story resonates. It is not about confiscation alone. It is about the fragile agreement between the present and the future. We are always leaving something behind. The question is whether what we leave behind is clear enough, honest enough, and complete enough to help those who come after us understand what we were, what we feared, what we chose. And now we return to the opening image, a person holding a camera, capturing a moment without knowing what it will become. That person is not only a witness to history, that person is a reminder that history begins in human hands, not in institutions, not in archives, in hands. So here is the final, timeless question, one that reaches beyond any single reel, any single vault, any single disappearance. When the next unforgettable moment arrives, when the world shifts and cameras rise, will we treat the record as something to control? Or will we treat it as something to share, carefully and courageously, so that truth can remain a place we can stand together?